A family smiles in 1912. But when the image was magnified, something horrifying was discovered in the background. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like something wasn't quite right? Today, we're diving into a chilling story from 1912 that will make you question everything you see in vintage family portraits. A seemingly innocent photograph of a smiling family turned into one of the most disturbing mysteries in photographic history when modern technology revealed what was hiding in the shadows all along. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to tell you about my other channel where I'm developing more incredible content like this. Make sure to check it out in the description below. Now, let's uncover what makes this particular photograph so terrifying that experts are still debating its meaning over a century later. The Henderson family of Riverside, Connecticut, was like any other upper-middle-class American family at the turn of the 20th century. Robert Henderson, a successful merchant in his early 40s, had built a comfortable life for his wife, Margaret, and their 3 children, Thomas, age 14, Eleanor, age 11, and little William, who had just turned 7 that spring. On a warm Saturday afternoon in June 1912, the Hendersons decided to commemorate their eldest son, Thomas's upcoming graduation from primary school, with a family photograph. This wasn't an everyday occurrence. Photography was still a relatively expensive and formal affair, requiring families to visit professional studios or hire traveling photographers who would set up elaborate equipment in clients' homes or gardens. The Henderson family chose to have their portrait taken in their backyard, beneath the sprawling oak tree that Robert had planted the year Thomas was born. The tree had grown magnificent over the years, its thick branches providing ample shade during Connecticut's humid summers. Margaret thought it would make the perfect backdrop, symbolic of their family's growth and strength. The photographer, a man named Ernest Whitmore, arrived at the Henderson residence around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Whitmore was known throughout the county as a meticulous craftsman who took pride in capturing not just images, but moments of genuine emotion. He spent nearly 30 minutes arranging the family, adjusting their positions to catch the best natural light filtering through the oak's leaves. Robert stood at the back, his hand resting proudly on Thomas's shoulder. Margaret sat in a wooden chair brought from the dining room, her posture perfect, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. Eleanor stood beside her mother, one hand gently touching Margaret's shoulder, while young William sat cross-legged on the grass in front, his face beaming with the uninhibited joy only a 7-year-old could display. "Everyone hold perfectly still," Whitmore instructed, disappearing beneath the black cloth draped over his large format camera. "This will take several seconds. No blinking, no moving, and most importantly, no breathing too heavily. Even the slightest movement will blur the image." The family froze in place, maintaining their smiles through sheer determination. The June sun cast dappled shadows across their faces, creating a portrait of American prosperity and happiness. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only 15 seconds, Whitmore emerged from beneath his cloth. "Excellent," he declared. "That should be a magnificent portrait. I'll have it developed and delivered to you within the week." The Henderson family relaxed, laughing at how challenging it was to remain motionless for so long. Young William complained that his legs had fallen asleep, while Eleanor adjusted her dress that had wrinkled slightly during the pose. They had no way of knowing that the image Whitmore had just captured would become the subject of intense scrutiny and unsettling speculation more than a century later. True to his word, Whitmore delivered the finished photograph 5 days later. The Henderson family was delighted with the result. The image was sharp and clear, capturing each family member with remarkable detail. Margaret's eyes sparkled with maternal warmth. Robert's expression conveyed quiet dignity. Thomas looked mature beyond his 14 years. Eleanor appeared sweet and demure, and William's infectious grin seemed to leap off the photographic paper. The family had the photograph framed and displayed it prominently in their sitting room, where visitors would often comment on what a handsome family they were. Over the years, the photograph became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations. It survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless family moves across different states. By the early 21st century, the photograph belonged to Sarah Henderson Martinez, Robert and Margaret's great-great-granddaughter, who lived in Portland, Oregon. Sarah had always been fascinated by her family's history and maintained an extensive collection of genealogical records, letters, and photographs dating back to the mid-1800s. The 1912 family portrait held a special place in Sarah's collection. She often wondered about these ancestors she'd never met, trying to imagine their lives, their hopes, their daily routines in an era so different from her own. The photograph seemed to bridge that temporal gap, offering a window into their world. In 2019, Sarah decided to have several of her oldest family photographs professionally digitized and restored. She wanted to preserve them for future generations, and perhaps discover details that might have faded or been difficult to see in the original prints. She contacted a local company specializing in historical photograph restoration and submitted several images, including the 1912 Henderson family portrait. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. The restoration specialist, a man named David Chen, was experienced in working with photographs from the early 20th century. He understood the technical limitations and quirks of the era's photographic processes. Using high-resolution scanning equipment and sophisticated image enhancement software, David could often reveal details invisible to the naked eye in century-old photographs. When David first scanned the Henderson photograph, he noted its remarkable condition. Despite being over 100 years old, the image had been well preserved, with minimal fading and no significant damage. He proceeded with his standard restoration process, carefully adjusting contrast, sharpening details, and removing minor imperfections caused by age. It was during the final enhancement phase, when David was increasing the clarity of the background elements, that he noticed something unusual. David Chen had been working in photograph restoration for 15 years, and he prided himself on maintaining professional detachment from the images he processed. Whether he was enhancing wedding portraits, restoring damaged war photographs, or digitizing family albums, he approached each project with the same methodical precision. However, the Henderson family photograph was beginning to unsettle him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He had noticed the anomaly while working on the background details, specifically the area beneath and behind the large oak tree. At first, David thought it was simply a shadow, perhaps caused by the way sunlight filtered through the branches on that June afternoon in 1912. But as he applied various enhancement filters to improve the overall image quality, the shadow began to take on a more defined shape. David zoomed in on the area, expanding it to fill his computer screen. What he saw made him pause. There, in the darkness, beneath the oak tree's lowest hanging branches, approximately 15 feet behind where the Henderson family had posed, was what appeared to be a figure, not a shadow. Not a tree trunk, a human-like figure. David's first instinct was that someone else had been in the yard during the photograph session, perhaps a neighbor or household staff member who hadn't realized they would appear in the frame. This wasn't uncommon in old photographs. The long exposure times required by early 20th century cameras often captured unintended subjects in the background. But something about this figure troubled him. Its position seemed deliberately obscured, as if whoever or whatever it was had been standing in the darkest possible spot, partially concealed behind the tree trunk. Moreover, the figure's posture was unusual. It appeared to be leaning forward slightly, and while the resolution wasn't sufficient to make out facial features clearly, the head seemed to be turned directly toward the Henderson family. David applied additional enhancement algorithms, trying to clarify the figure's details without introducing artifacts or distortions. Professional ethics demanded that he not manipulate the image beyond restoration, but he needed to understand what he was seeing. The more he enhanced the area, the more disturbing the figure became. It wore what appeared to be dark clothing, possibly a long coat or cloak, which would have been unusual attire for a Connecticut summer day. The figure's hands seemed to be positioned strangely, perhaps clasped in front or raised slightly, though the shadows made it difficult to determine with certainty. Most unsettling was what David could only describe as the quality of the figure's presence. Unlike the Henderson family members, who were sharply focused and clearly defined, the figure appeared slightly blurred, as if it had moved during the exposure. Yet it wasn't blurred in the way someone who accidentally walked through the frame would be. There was an almost ethereal quality to it, a suggestion of form without complete solidity. David saved his work and stepped away from his computer. He needed fresh eyes and a clear head. He made himself a cup of coffee and called his colleague, Michelle Tran, who worked in the office next door and specialized in authentication and analysis of historical photographs. "Michelle, can you take a look at something for me?" David asked when she answered. "I'm working on a restoration from 1912, and there's something in the background I'd like your opinion on." Michelle arrived a few minutes later, curious about David's uncharacteristic request for assistance. He rarely asked for second opinions, confident in his own expertise. She studied the image on his screen, first at normal zoom, then as David gradually zoomed in on the figure beneath the oak tree. "That's odd," Michelle said, leaning closer to the monitor. "It looks like someone was standing there during the exposure. Did the client mention anything about other people being present?" "No information provided," David replied. "The work order just says it's a family portrait from 1912. But look at the positioning. Look at how the figure is placed in the deepest shadow and how it seems to be watching the family." Michelle studied the image for several more minutes, occasionally asking David to adjust the enhancement settings. She examined the photographic characteristics, the grain structure, the tonal range, looking for any evidence of manipulation or double exposure. "It doesn't appear to be a later addition or a photographic trick," she concluded. "The grain pattern is consistent throughout the image, and the figure appears to be part of the original exposure. But I'll admit, there's something off about it. The way it's positioned, the fact that it's almost perfectly concealed in shadow while the rest of the scene is well lit, it's unusual. Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far." David nodded. "Should I mention it to the client?" Michelle considered the question. "You probably should. They might know who it was, or at least confirm whether anyone else was present that day. It's part of the historical record of the photograph." David agreed and prepared his restoration files to send to Sarah Henderson Martinez. Along with the enhanced images, he included a brief note. "During the restoration process, I noticed what appears to be an additional figure in the background of the photograph, standing beneath the tree behind your family members. You may want to examine the enhanced image to see if you can identify this person. It's possible they were a household member or visitor who was inadvertently captured in the frame." Sarah received the digitized photographs 3 days later. She immediately opened the files, excited to see her ancestors' faces with greater clarity than the aging original print had allowed. The enhancement was remarkable. She could see individual strands of her great-great-grandmother's hair, the texture of the fabrics in their clothing, even the expression in young William's eyes. Then she read David's note and zoomed in on the background area he'd referenced. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the figure came into focus on her screen. She had looked at the original photograph countless times over the years, and she had never noticed anything unusual in the background. But now, with the enhanced resolution and clarity, the figure was unmistakable. Who was this person? Why were they standing in the shadows? And why had no one in her family ever mentioned them? Sarah Henderson Martinez couldn't stop staring at the enhanced photograph. She had displayed it on her computer screen for the past 2 hours, zooming in and out, adjusting the brightness and contrast, trying to make sense of the shadowy figure that seemed to watch her ancestors from beneath the oak tree. Her first instinct was to consult the family records she had meticulously maintained. Sarah had always been the family historian, the one who kept track of births, deaths, marriages, and the various stories passed down through generations. Surely somewhere in her collection of letters, diaries, and documents there would be a mention of this photograph and who else might have been present that day. She pulled out the box containing materials related to Robert and Margaret Henderson and their children. There were letters Margaret had written to her sister, describing daily life in Connecticut. There were business records from Robert's merchant business. There were school reports for the children, but Sarah could find no specific mention of the photograph taken in June 1912. However, she did find something that gave her pause. Among Margaret's letters was one dated August 1912, just 2 months after the photograph was taken. In it, Margaret wrote to her sister, "The children have been having nightmares lately, particularly little William. He insists that someone is watching our house at night, standing beneath the oak tree. Robert assures him it's just shadows and imagination, but I confess the boy's fear has begun to unsettle me as well. Perhaps the summer heat is affecting us all." Sarah read the passage 3 times, her heart beating faster. Was it merely coincidence that William had reported seeing someone beneath the same tree where the mysterious figure appeared in the photograph? Or was there a connection? She continued searching through the records and found another troubling detail. In September 1912, according to a brief newspaper clipping saved in the family archives, there had been a break-in at the Henderson residence. The article described how the family had awakened to find their back door open and muddy footprints tracked through the first floor of the house. Nothing had been stolen, but several items had been moved or disturbed. The police investigated but never identified a suspect. Most disturbing was the final detail in the article. The muddy footprints led from the back door directly to the sitting room, where they stopped in front of the wall where the family photograph was displayed. The intruder had apparently stood there for some time before leaving the same way they had entered. Sarah felt her skin prickle. These couldn't all be coincidences. Something about that photograph had significance beyond being a simple family portrait. She decided to reach out to David Chen, the restoration specialist, and share what she had discovered. Perhaps with this additional context, he might have insights into the mysterious figure. She also began researching the history of the Hendersons' Connecticut property, looking for any information that might explain the presence of the figure. The property records revealed that the land had been purchased by Robert Henderson in 1898, and before that, it had belonged to a family named Ashford. The Ashfords had lived there since the 1840s, but the line had died out when the last family member, a woman named Catherine Ashford, passed away in 1897. The property had been sold at auction, which is when Robert Henderson acquired it. Sarah found an obituary for Catherine Ashford in a digitized newspaper archive. Catherine had been unmarried, living alone on the property for the final 20 years of her life, after her parents had died. The obituary described her as a reclusive woman who rarely ventured into town and preferred the company of her gardens to that of people. Interestingly, the obituary mentioned that Catherine had been found deceased beneath the ancient oak tree in her backyard, apparently having suffered a fatal heart attack while tending to her flowers. Her body hadn't been discovered for nearly a week, as she had no close neighbors and few acquaintances who might have noticed her absence. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. The oak tree. The same oak tree the Hendersons had chosen as the backdrop for their family photograph. The same tree beneath which the mysterious figure appeared to be standing. She needed more information about Catherine Ashford. Using genealogical databases and historical records, Sarah began piecing together Catherine's life story. She discovered that Catherine had been engaged to be married in 1875, but her fiancé had died in an accident just weeks before their wedding. After that tragedy, Catherine had withdrawn from society, eventually becoming the reclusive figure described in her obituary. Sarah found a few more references to Catherine in local historical records. One account, from a church newsletter in 1893, mentioned that Catherine had approached the pastor seeking help, claiming that she was being followed and that she felt watched constantly. The pastor had apparently attributed her concerns to loneliness and perhaps mental instability brought on by her isolated life. Another record, from police files Sarah accessed through a historical society, documented a complaint Catherine had filed in 1895. She reported that someone was trespassing on her property at night, standing beneath the oak tree and watching her house. Police investigated, but found no evidence of any intruder. The parallels to what Margaret Henderson had written about William's nightmares were striking. Two different families, separated by years, both reporting someone watching them from beneath the same tree. Sarah contacted a local historian in Connecticut who specialized in the region where the Henderson property was located. She shared the photograph and the information she had uncovered, asking if the historian knew anything more about the Ashford property or Catherine herself. The historian, an elderly man named Professor Edmund Wright, was immediately interested. He had actually researched the Ashford family years earlier as part of a broader project on Connecticut's early settlers. He told Sarah that the oak tree on the property was believed to be well over 200 years old, predating the house by decades. Local tradition held that the tree had been used as a landmark by travelers in the colonial era. Professor Wright also mentioned something that made Sarah's blood run cold. There were rumors, which he had always dismissed as local folklore, that the tree had been used as a hanging site in the early 1700s. According to the stories, a man accused of witchcraft had been executed there, though Professor Wright had never found documentation to confirm this. He had always assumed the stories were simply the kind of dark mythology that tends to accumulate around old landmarks. If you're enjoying this video so far, leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Sarah thanked Professor Wright for the information and returned to the enhanced photograph. She stared at the figure beneath the tree, trying to discern any features, any clue as to its identity or nature. The more she learned, the less rational explanations seemed to fit. She was a rational person, someone who believed in facts and evidence, not superstition or supernatural explanations. Yet the accumulation of strange coincidences was becoming impossible to ignore. She decided to take one more step in her investigation. She would travel to Connecticut herself and visit the location where the photograph had been taken. Perhaps seeing the place in person would provide clarity, or at least help her understand what her ancestors had experienced in that house beneath that tree. 3 weeks after receiving the enhanced photograph, Sarah Henderson Martinez stood in front of what had once been her ancestors' home in Riverside, Connecticut. The property had changed hands many times since the Henderson family had lived there, and the current owners, a couple named the Petersons, had graciously agreed to let Sarah visit and take photographs. The house itself had been renovated extensively over the decades. The original structure was still visible beneath modern additions and updates, but it looked quite different from how it appeared in the handful of old photographs Sarah had found in her family archives. However, one element remained essentially unchanged: the massive oak tree in the backyard. Sarah walked around to the back of the house, and her breath caught in her throat. The tree was enormous, even larger than she had imagined. Its trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter, and its branches spread out like a natural cathedral, casting deep shadows across the yard. Even in broad daylight, there were pockets of darkness beneath the tree where sunlight never seemed to fully penetrate. Mrs. Peterson, who had accompanied Sarah, noticed her reaction to the tree. "Impressive, isn't it?" she said. The arborist who examined it last year estimated it's at least 250 years old, possibly older. It's actually designated as a heritage tree by the town. Has anything unusual ever happened with the tree? Sarah asked, trying to sound casual. Any strange stories or events? Mrs. Peterson laughed nervously. Why do you ask? Are there family legends or something? Something like that, Sarah replied. I've been researching my family's history, and I've come across some odd references to this tree. I'm trying to understand what they meant. Mrs. Peterson's expression became more serious. Well, I don't like to sound superstitious, but yes, there have been some odd things. Nothing dangerous or anything like that, but unsettling. We sometimes see what looks like someone standing beneath the tree at night, but when we look closer or turn on the outside lights, there's nothing there, just shadows. Sarah felt chills despite the warm afternoon. How often does this happen? It used to happen frequently when we first moved in about 8 years ago, Mrs. Peterson said. Several times a month. My husband thought it was just deer, or maybe neighborhood kids cutting through our yard, but the shape always seemed too still, too deliberate. We eventually installed motion sensor lights, thinking that would deter trespassers, but the lights rarely trigger. It's like whatever is there doesn't actually move in a way that activates the sensors. Does it still happen? Less frequently now, maybe once or twice a year. We've kind of gotten used to it. We've lived here long enough that we just accept it as part of the property. This is an old area with a lot of history. Strange things happen in old places, right? Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she agreed. Strange things might happen, but should they? And should multiple families across more than a century all experience the same strangeness? Mrs. Peterson excused herself to return to the house, leaving Sarah alone in the yard. Sarah walked slowly toward the oak tree, her phone in hand, ready to photograph the area where the mysterious figure had appeared in the 1912 photograph. She tried to position herself approximately where Ernest Whitmore would have set up his camera, estimating the angle and perspective. As she approached the tree, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. Sarah told herself it was simply the shade, the way the tree's thick canopy blocked the sun, but the chill felt like more than just absence of sunlight. It felt present, intentional, as if the cold itself was watching her. She circled around to the area where the figure had been standing in the old photograph. The ground there was slightly depressed, as if the soil had settled over time, or as if something heavy had stood in that exact spot for a very long time. The bark on that side of the tree was darker, almost black, though whether from age, disease, or some other factor, Sarah couldn't determine. She raised her phone to take a photograph, framing the shot to include the area where the house would have been visible in 1912. Through her phone screen, she saw the same view Ernest Whitmore would have captured: the spreading branches, the dappled sunlight, the deep shadows beneath. Then something changed. On her phone screen, in the shadows beneath the tree, Sarah saw movement. Not the rustling of leaves or the sway of branches in the breeze. It was darker, more solid. The shape that had appeared in the 1912 photograph was there again, visible on her phone screen, but she whirled around to look directly, not visible to her naked eye. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked back at her phone screen. The figure was still there. Slightly clearer now in the digital rendering, it appeared to be looking directly at her, or rather, at where she was standing, just as it had looked at the Henderson family over a century ago. She forced herself to take the photograph, capturing what her phone could see, even though her eyes could not. Then she quickly stepped away from the tree, her heart pounding, her rational mind struggling to process what she had just experienced. Back in her hotel room that evening, Sarah downloaded the photograph she had taken. On her laptop's larger screen, the figure was unmistakable. It was in almost the exact same position as in the 1912 photograph, though the angle was slightly different due to where Sarah had been standing. The same dark clothing, the same forward-leaning posture, the same sense of watching. Sarah spent hours that night researching similar phenomena. She found numerous accounts of figures appearing in photographs that weren't visible to the naked eye. Some researchers attributed this to pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and faces in random stimuli. Others suggested it might be related to the way camera sensors processed light differently than human eyes. But none of these explanations felt sufficient. This wasn't a random pattern or a trick of light. This was the same figure in the same location, appearing across more than a century to multiple witnesses. It had been captured by both early 20th century film photography and modern digital imaging. It had been seen by children and adults, by people who knew about it and people who didn't. Sarah contacted Professor Wright again and sent him the photograph she had taken. His response came quickly, and it was clear from his tone that he was both fascinated and disturbed. He had begun his own deeper investigation into the history of the property and the oak tree, and he had uncovered something significant. Professor Wright had found records from the 1720s, documenting that a man named Silas Blackwood had indeed been executed on that property, though not for witchcraft as the rumors suggested. Blackwood had been convicted of murder, specifically of killing 3 members of a neighboring family during a property dispute. He had been hanged from the oak tree, which was already substantial even then. According to the trial records Professor Wright had located, Blackwood had maintained his innocence to the end, claiming that he had been falsely accused by the actual perpetrator of the crimes. His final words, recorded by the clerk present at the execution, were a promise that he would remain at that spot until the truth was known, watching for justice. The execution had taken place in June 1723. The Henderson family photograph had been taken in June 1912. Sarah had visited the property in June 2019, all the same month, spanning nearly 3 centuries. Professor Wright's email continued with more disturbing information. He had found references in various historical documents to people who had lived on that property, reporting the same experience, a sense of being watched from beneath the tree, particularly in June. The Ashford family, who had owned the property longest before the Hendersons, had apparently lost 2 children to unexplained deaths in June of consecutive years in the 1850s. Catherine Ashford, who had become reclusive later in her life, had written in her diary, which Professor Wright had located in a historical society collection, that she felt imprisoned by the gaze from beneath my own tree. The Henderson family had left the property suddenly in 1915, according to records Sarah already knew about, but she had never understood why. They had moved to Massachusetts and never returned to Connecticut, despite Robert's business being established there. Now Sarah wondered what had finally driven them away. Sarah Henderson Martinez sat in her home office in Portland, surrounded by documents, photographs, and notes that represented months of investigation into the mysterious figure that appeared in her family's 1912 photograph. It was now December 2019, 6 months since she had first received the enhanced image from David Chen. She had compiled an extensive file of evidence, testimony, and historical documentation. She had interviewed descendants of other families who had lived on the riverside property, finding that almost all of them had similar stories of being watched from beneath the oak tree. She had consulted with paranormal researchers, skeptics, photographers, historians, and psychologists, seeking any explanation that might make sense of what she and others had experienced. The responses varied wildly. Some researchers insisted it was evidence of genuine paranormal activity, perhaps a residual haunting or an intelligent entity bound to the location. Others argued it was mass suggestion, a case of people seeing what they expected to see based on local legends and family stories. Some suggested it might be related to unusual properties of the tree itself, perhaps electromagnetic anomalies or infrasound that could affect perception and camera equipment. A few photographers proposed that it might be a peculiarity of how that specific location interacted with light at certain times of year, creating optical illusions that happened to resemble a human figure. One scientist suggested that the tree's roots might have absorbed and retained images like a natural photographic plate, somehow reprojecting them under the right conditions, a theory that sounded more like science fiction than science. Yet none of these explanations fully accounted for the consistency of the phenomenon across different time periods, different witnesses, and vastly different photographic technologies. None explained why the figure appeared specifically in June. None addressed why it always seemed to be watching, observing whoever was present. Sarah had returned to Connecticut twice more, each time experiencing the same unsettling phenomenon, the figure visible through camera lenses, but not to the naked eye, always in the same position beneath the tree. On her third visit, in October, she had brought David Chen with her. He had wanted to see the location himself and attempt to photograph it using various types of equipment. David had captured the figure using digital cameras, film cameras, infrared photography, and even old-style glass plate photography, similar to what Ernest Whitmore would have used in 1912. Every method recorded the same presence. Yet when they examined the area directly, when they walked to the exact spot where the figure appeared to stand, there was nothing unusual. Just tree trunk, shadow, and the slight depression in the ground Sarah had noticed on her first visit. David, who prided himself on rational skepticism, had left Connecticut shaken. "I can't explain it," he had told Sarah during their flight back to Oregon. "I've worked with thousands of photographs, from daguerreotypes to modern digital images. I know about light, shadow, lens artifacts, camera glitches, every trick that can make something appear in a photograph that isn't really there. This is none of those things. This is something else." Sarah had also learned more about the Henderson family's experiences after the photograph was taken. Through letters and diaries she'd managed to locate from other family members, she'd pieced together a more complete picture of their final years in Connecticut. Young William Henderson, who had been 7 years old in the photograph, had become increasingly disturbed by what he described as the man under the tree who watches us. His nightmares had intensified throughout 1912 and 1913. Margaret's letters to her sister documented her growing concern about William's mental state and her own increasing unease. Robert, ever pragmatic, had initially dismissed his son's fears as childish imagination, but even he had eventually begun to feel uncomfortable in his own backyard. The family had hosted a garden party in June 1914, exactly 2 years after the photograph was taken. According to accounts Sarah had found, the party had ended abruptly when William had thrown a screaming fit, pointing at the oak tree and insisting that he's angry that everyone is here. Several guests had later reported feeling watched or followed as they departed that evening, though most attributed it to the disturbing scene William had caused. In September 1915, the Hendersons had put the property up for sale at a significant loss and moved to Massachusetts within a matter of weeks. Sarah had found a letter from Margaret to a friend, written after the move, in which she mentioned that Robert had finally agreed they needed to leave because the house no longer feels like ours, and perhaps it never truly was. The most chilling discovery Sarah had made was related to the photographer Ernest Whitmore. After taking the Henderson family photograph in June 1912, Whitmore had continued working in the area for another year. Then, according to records Sarah had found, he had simply stopped. His business had closed, and he had apparently left Connecticut. Sarah had tracked Whitmore's descendants and learned that after 1913, Ernest had never practiced photography again. He had moved to New York City and worked various manual labor jobs until his death in 1937. His daughter, interviewed by a local historian in the 1960s, had mentioned that her father had experienced something while working in Connecticut that had turned him against his craft. He had destroyed all his photographic equipment and refused to allow anyone to take his picture for the rest of his life. When the daughter had asked him why, Ernest had apparently responded, "Because I saw something I wasn't meant to see, and I realized that cameras can capture more than just the visible world. Some things that we can't or shouldn't see are nonetheless there, watching us. I don't want to see them, and I don't want them to see me." Sarah had tried to locate any other photographs Whitmore had taken in June 1912, wondering if the Henderson photograph was unique or if the figure appeared in other images from that period. She had found 3 other family portraits Whitmore had shot in Riverside that month, but none of them showed anything unusual. Only the Henderson photograph, taken at that specific property beneath that specific tree, contained the mysterious figure. This raised more questions. Was the phenomenon specific to that location? If so, why had it appeared in Sarah's modern digital photograph as well? Was it somehow connected to the Henderson family specifically? But if so, why had other families who lived there reported similar experiences? Sarah had also discovered that the oak tree had been scheduled for removal several times over the years due to disease concerns or development plans, but each time the plans had fallen through for various reasons. Contractors had backed out, funding had disappeared, or local opposition had successfully blocked the removal. The tree stood there still, as it had for over 2.5 centuries, seemingly immovable and permanent. In November 2019, Sarah had arranged one final visit to the property. Mrs. Peterson had mentioned that the family might be selling the house and moving out of state, and Sarah wanted to photograph the tree one more time before access became uncertain. She had brought her daughter, Emma, who was 15 years old, older than Thomas Henderson had been when his family's photograph was taken. Sarah hadn't told Emma much about the mystery, wanting to see if her daughter would experience anything without preconceived expectations. They had walked into the backyard together, Sarah filming with her phone's video camera, Emma curious about why her mother had dragged her across the country to look at a tree. When they approached the oak, Emma had suddenly stopped walking. "Mom," she had said, her voice uncertain, "is someone supposed to be there?" "Where?" Sarah had asked, though she knew what Emma was going to say. "Under the tree, in the shadows. I thought I saw someone standing there, but they're not moving, and I can't quite see them clearly. Are they real?" Sarah had checked her phone's screen. The figure was there, as it always was. She had shown the screen to Emma, who had gasped. "That's what I'm seeing, but only kind of. Like I can almost see it when I'm not looking directly at it, but when I try to focus on it, it's just shadows. But I can feel that someone's there. I can feel them watching us." It was the same experience reported by others across more than a century. Visible yet invisible, present yet absent, watching but never approaching or threatening. Simply there, endlessly observing from beneath the ancient oak. Sarah and Emma had left Connecticut that evening, both quieter than usual, processing what they had experienced. During the flight home, Emma had asked the questions Sarah had been asking herself for months. What does it want? Why is it there? Sarah had no answer then, and she still had no answer now as she sat in her office reviewing everything she had learned. The figure appeared to be connected to Silas Blackwood, the man executed in 1723, but that raised more questions than it answered. If it was Blackwood, why did he continue to watch that spot? What justice was he waiting for? And was the figure actually Blackwood? Or was it something else that had taken residence there, using the execution and the lingering story as an anchor to the physical world? Some researchers Sarah had consulted suggested that the figure might not be a ghost or spirit at all, but rather some kind of temporal echo, a recording of a moment or presence that had somehow been impressed into the location itself, particularly into the tree. Perhaps the oak, having stood as witness to so many human lives and deaths across centuries, had somehow absorbed the emotional and psychological weight of those events and certain conditions. June, the angle of light, the presence of cameras that could capture wavelengths human eyes could not, allowed that imprint to become visible. Others had proposed that the figure was not from the past at all, but from the future, some kind of observer studying historical moments through methods humanity had yet to discover. This explanation seemed far-fetched to Sarah, yet it was no more implausible than any other theory that attempted to account for the evidence. The most troubling theory Sarah had encountered came from a theoretical physicist who specialized in the intersection of quantum mechanics and consciousness. He had proposed that the act of observation itself, particularly photographic observation, might be interacting with the location in unexpected ways. Perhaps the figure didn't exist until it was photographed, coming into being through the act of measurement and observation. Quantum uncertainty collapsing into a definite but inexplicable state. Sarah didn't pretend to understand the mathematics behind this theory, but the philosophical implications were staggering. It suggested that the figure was both real and not real, existing in a liminal state between possibility and actuality, and that cameras served as the bridge that allowed it to manifest partially in the observable world. Whatever the truth, Sarah knew that she had encountered something that defied easy explanation. The 1912 Henderson family photograph that had seemed so innocent, so ordinary, had opened a window onto a mystery that continued to unfold. She thought about her ancestors smiling for Ernest Whitmore's camera on that June day, unaware that they were being watched from the shadows. She thought about Catherine Ashford, dying alone beneath that tree, perhaps finally joining the presence that had watched her throughout her life. She thought about Silas Blackwood, proclaiming his innocence as the rope was placed around his neck, promising to remain until justice was found. Had justice ever been found? Had Blackwood been guilty or innocent? The trial records Professor Wright had located were inconclusive, based largely on testimony from a single witness whose reliability was questionable even by 18th century standards. Perhaps Blackwood had been telling the truth. Perhaps he had been falsely accused and executed, and his final promise had been more than just the desperate words of a dying man. Or perhaps the truth was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with Blackwood or any human story. Perhaps the tree itself was the key, ancient beyond human memory, standing as a silent witness to centuries of human activity. Perhaps what appeared in photographs was not a person at all, but the tree's own awareness, its observation of those who stood in its shade, its slow and patient watching that transcended human understanding of time and consciousness. Sarah knew that she might never have definitive answers. She had documented everything, compiled all the evidence she could gather, interviewed everyone who might have relevant information. She had written articles about her investigation, shared the photographs and accounts online, seeking input from anyone who might offer insight. The responses had been varied and often contradictory, but they had all agreed on one point. Something was there, beneath that tree, watching across the years. The mystery endured, as perhaps it always would. The figure in the 1912 photograph remained unexplained, and Sarah suspected it would remain unexplained long after she was gone. Perhaps that was the nature of such things, to exist at the edge of understanding, visible enough to be known, but never clear enough to be fully comprehended. On her desk, Sarah kept a printed copy of the enhanced Henderson family photograph, the figure clearly visible in the background. She looked at it often, studying her ancestors' smiling faces, thinking about that June day in 1912, when a simple family portrait became a window onto something vast and inexplicable. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah would look at the photograph and feel as if the figure was looking back at her across the years and the distance. Not threatening, not malevolent, but simply observing, endlessly patient, endlessly present, watching as it had always watched, as it perhaps would always watch. The oak tree still stands in Riverside, Connecticut. It still casts deep shadows across the yard where the Henderson family once posed for their photograph. And in those shadows, visible to cameras but not to the naked eye, something still waits and watches. What it is, what it wants, and why it remains, These questions persist without answers, much like the figure itself persists without explanation. The mystery continues, captured forever in that enhanced photograph from 1912, inviting endless speculation but offering no final resolution. Some mysteries, Sarah had come to understand, are meant to remain unsolved. They exist not to be explained, but to remind us that the world contains more than what we can easily comprehend, that reality might be stranger and more complex than our rational minds want to believe. The figure beneath the oak tree stands as testament to this truth, silently watching as the years pass, as generations come and go, as technology advances and understanding deepens. Yet it remains, unchanged and unexplained, a constant presence at the edge of the visible world, forever captured in that moment in 1912 when the Henderson family smiled for the camera, unaware that they were not alone. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. I love hearing your opinions and answering your questions. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos.